Hello once again. Welcome to the Cafe on Air podcast. I'm your host, Big Italy 42. Before we get started on talking about last night's great performers, today's slate, I'd like you to join me in a quick moment of silence for all of the lineups that were murdered last night by Russell Westbrook and James Harden, including many of my own, some of which included both players. So if you struggled with that as well last night, if you had a bad night due to the two top options both having subpar performances, then we're just going to have a quick moment of silence here. All right, now that we got that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and talk about some great performers from last night, none of which include James Harden or Russell Westbrook. And Russell Westbrook did come close to a triple-double. Unfortunately, one of those double-digit totals was turnovers. So that's about it, the highlight of his night last night. Chris Paul, bad ankle and all, definitely bad knee and all, I should say. Definitely had his way with Westbrook last night. Obviously, all great things have to come to an end, and seems like that price tag finally caught up to Westbrook, and he had his worst game since Kevin Durant went down. Top performer from last night, Andre Drummond, 22 points and a career-high 27 rebounds against the Golden State Warriors. Really kept the Pistons in the game last night. Unfortunately, it fell just short. Chris Middleton had 30 real points again, kind of alternating big games and bad games as he has been for a little over a week now. Chris Paul, I already mentioned, had a nice game. 33 points last night to go along with 4 rebounds and 9 assists. JJ Redick, nice game as well. Chris Anderson, 18 and 14. A little surprising there. Not a guy that usually plays heavy minutes, played almost 30 minutes last night. And Danilo Gallinari in just 23 minutes. Just under 24 minutes, I should say. 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists. So, great game for him in a small amount of time. Aaron Brooks, phenomenal game as well. 31 real points, over 40 fantasy points. Brook Lopez, 15 and 14, nice game as well. And Pau Gasol, 27 and 16. Nice monster game there for Pau Gasol as well. So, if you had some, all, maybe hopefully more than a few of those players last night, you probably did pretty well. If you went the fade Westbrook and or Harden route, you probably had yourself a nice night. I unfortunately did not. I had quite a bit of Russell Westbrook and James Harden, and I would do it again given the same scenario. So unfortunately didn't pan out for me last night. Missed out on some top players. Got some late news where Joakim Noah was ruled out, which made Pau Gasol the obvious top play at power forward. So something that we had missed out on the podcast yesterday because we had no indication that Noah would sit for that game. So things like that, keep in mind as you're moving forward, you're looking through the day. Make sure you monitor that news and who it impacts, because obviously I put out these podcasts early in the day, right around noon Eastern time. So a lot of times news that is pertinent now may or may not be pertinent later. New things change, new opportunities arise, value plays, etc. So always make sure you're monitoring your news. Great place to be is on Twitter. You can ask me any questions there at BigItaly42. There's a lot of great resources there, a lot of beat writers, things like that. If you got any questions about who to follow, where to look for that information, I'd be more than happy to help you out. So hit me up with those questions. And without further ado, we're going to get on to tonight's slate. I'm going to go over some of the Vegas odds here for these to start things off, just kind of mix it up a little bit. And I'm going to break those down first, give you some numbers, then I'm going to go into some plays. So a lot of really small totals tonight. In fact, 4 of the 5 games, all under 190 totals. So not a lot to be seen here offensively tonight, according to Vegas. So Milwaukee at Indiana. Indiana's a 7-point favorite, 187.5 point total there. Memphis at Washington. Started out as a pick'em, now Washington favored by 2, 182.5 total there. So just a tiny total. I'll get into a little bit of my thinking on that one here in a minute. Cleveland at San Antonio, obviously the marquee matchup of the day. Cleveland, now a 1.5 point favorite, started out as a pick'em, 207 point total, by far, by nearly 20 points, the highest total of the night. So, going to want some exposure there. Houston at Utah, Houston a 2-point favorite, 189.5 point total there. And New York at the LA Lakers, the battle of the tanks, 189 point total. Lakers favored by 6.5. If you had told me earlier this season you'd see the Lakers favored against anyone by 6.5 points after Kobe Bryant went down, I would tell you were insane. But if there was ever a spot, now it's here. And I mean, how embarrassing for the Knicks. 6.5 point underdogs at the Los Angeles Lakers, an equally terrible team. So maybe some fantasy goodness to be had there. But we're going to start off at the top here. I'm going to do FanDuel and DraftKings on this shorter slate. No sense in breaking it all up. Starting at point guard, your top option on the night has got to be John Wall. He has a tremendously great price on DraftKings, just $8,300. And you don't love the matchup against Memphis, but as I alluded to earlier, Mike Conley left last night's game with an ankle injury and was limping after the game. Says that Memphis says they're hoping he will be able to go tonight. No indication yet. He's officially listed as questionable. So if that swells up, he's not able to go. We're going to go back to one of our favorite value plays that we've seen fill in for Mike Conley many times. Bino Udrih. He is minimum priced on DraftKings, 3.7K on FanDuel, so just above the minimum 3,500 level there. And this is a guy who's a great point per minute performer. You're not expecting enormous things, but if Conley does sit out tonight, which I think probably the Grizzlies are erring on the side of him sitting, that's all speculation on my end right now. Definitely monitor that situation, but even in limited minutes, I mean, Udrih's got it done before. Last 3 games, 15 minutes, 20 fantasy points. 19 minutes, 20 fantasy points, 15, 10.75. So he's a guy that he will be a great, very popular cash game play. If Conley sits, he'll be in all of my cash games. Don't think he's a terrible tournament play either, being minimum salary. I mean, he doesn't have a ton of upside, but 20 and 25 fantasy points there easily crushes that price tag. So monitor the Mike Conley situation. That's going to be a big key for tonight's slate. And next up, you've got Kyrie Irving, $7,600 on DraftKings. And he's a little bit more expensive over on FanDuel at $79. I'm not in love with him. I think he's a fine play. He's got a decent amount of upside. But obviously, I mean, you've got LeBron James, who's in a much tougher matchup. Obviously, Kyrie matched up against Tony Parker, not a great defender by any means. And then you've got Kevin Love. And that's pretty much where all the value lies, as you know, with the Cavaliers. So if I have to choose one of the 3, I'll get to that in a few minutes here. But Irving's kind of a secondary play for me. I think he's a great play for tournaments. I don't think he's necessary in cash games at that price. Moving down just a little bit further, you've got George Hill. You kind of like the matchup against Mike Carter-Williams. Not a great defender, but if we're looking on DraftKings, I can get Carter-Williams at the exact same price, and he is really starting to turn it on. Only $6,500 on DraftKings. Last 4 games, 33, 29, 39, and 36 fantasy points on DraftKings. Came close to a triple-double last night. 11, 9, and 6. I mean, maybe not quite in the assist category, but 6, 7, 9, and 7 assists his last 4 games. He's not an efficient shooter usually. Turns the ball over a little bit more than you'd like. So, I mentioned this before. Better fantasy player than a real-life player, but that price on DraftKings has me very interested on the short slate tonight. $7,800 on FanDuel is too much. No thanks there for me in a less than ideal matchup. A little bit further, Mike Conley. Obviously, if he plays, you like him against John Wall. A little bit faster of a pace than he's used to, but probably not for me with some other options. Next guy up, you do like Tony Parker, or at least I do like Tony Parker. Playing great basketball. His price is way lower than it should be for his recent production. 3 straight games over 41 fantasy points on DraftKings. Just $5,900. $6,300 on FanDuel is a little bit more expensive, but I still think he's in play. Big game for the Spurs. They've won 6 in a row. Trying to move up the Western Conference standings. Just past Dallas the other day. Currently sitting there in the 6th spot. So Spurs obviously trying to get up to at least that 4 spot. Got the work cut out for them. Games like this are huge. And got to think that Tony Parker is going to be get up and ready for this one, especially with Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili both expected to play. Duncan hyperextended his elbow last game, left. Spurs expect him to play. Ginobili was sick. They expect him to play as well. So monitor those situations also. If Ginobili's unable to go, you're going to see a little bit more of an offensive role for Parker, so that bumps him even more for me. Next up, Jordan Clarkson, $5,400 on DraftKings and $5,800 on FanDuel. I think he's got a great floor. You look at his recent logs, he's pretty much a lock for 25 fantasy points. A fine matchup against New York. No great defenders there, really, top to bottom at all. I mean, obviously the worst team in the league. Pretty terrible against every position. Certainly in play. Prefer him, obviously, significantly over Jeremy Lin, who didn't practice yesterday. Supposed to play, but really not for me. Maybe in a tournament bullet, but his minutes definitely trending downward. Alexei Shved, Shved's sanity, has been sweeping the nation. And a couple things I want to point out with this. He's obviously in play. It's a good matchup against the Lakers. Worst in the league against point guards. But he scored 52 fantasy points last time out at just 3.4K on DraftKings. But you look at his averages. For instance, he had 10 rebounds in that game. For his career, he's averaging 3.8 rebounds per 36 minutes. So if I had to bet on this, I would guess that it's very unlikely he ever has 10 rebounds in a game again, as mostly a reserve player and a guy who isn't even going to necessarily be locked into the starting role tonight because Tim Hardaway Jr. could be back. I assume he probably earned himself a start, but the guy did shoot 4 for 7 from three-point range, had 10 rebounds, which I think the 10 rebounds is unsustainable. 7 assists is obviously good. I don't think that's too much out of the realm of possibility. He averages 5 per 36 for his career. And 52.5 fantasy points, obviously great, but he got the double-double bonus, and that was in 41 minutes. So you don't know that he's going to play those big minutes again. Not saying don't play him. I'm just saying I won't be all in on him. I'll have some shares, but not going crazy with Alexei Shved. I don't think that a game like that is likely anytime soon again. If you want a cheap guy, still kind of coming off the bench, you could look at Trey Burke, but really not for me. I mean, I'm looking at the more expensive guys I think are safer. You could get some Langston Galloway if you wanted. Kind of had a down game last game, just 8.5 fantasy points. Seemed like Alexei Shved was kind of controlling the offense a little bit more, so maybe a little concern there, but he's only 4,200 on DraftKings. I think you do much worse. Obviously, I mentioned Bina Udra, so that's your value play of the day if Mike Conley sits. Moving on to shooting guard. You're going with James Harden at the top option, and as I introduced yesterday, to play or stay away. I didn't mention one on point guard because there weren't that many expensive options. I'm saving that, actually, for the next guy, but James Harden is the top option on tonight's slate. You've got LeBron James matched up against Kawhi Leonard, one of the toughest matchups in the league. Obviously, LeBron is LeBron. He's going to do what he's going to do, and I'll get to that in a minute. But James Harden, despite Utah's great numbers against every position, really, they're playing great defensive basketball right now. Rudy Gobert, the best rim protector in the entire league. But James Harden, a lot of his points do come off being aggressive, attacking the basket. Maybe a little bit of that will be taken away from Rudy Gobert and his presence inside tonight. But that doesn't really concern me with James Harden. I mean, we've seen it before in tough matchups. He goes off. Last night in an ideal matchup, he struggled. Shot just 7 for 19. But once again, I mean, you've got to take into account that James Harden is by far the top option here at shooting guard. And if he does score 50, 60 fantasy points and you don't have him, you are behind the pack very, very quickly. So it's another one of those opportunity cost situations. It's not a lock that he's going to hit 50, 60 fantasy points, but he certainly has that upside, and there's not a whole lot of other guys in this position with that upside. So keep that in mind. Not saying he's a must, but I do think you're going to need some exposure, especially if you're playing multiple lineups. I don't think he's a smart fade tonight on this short slate. All right, my to play or stay away is Rodney Stuckey, sitting at 6.3K on FanDuel and DraftKings. 58.5 fantasy points on DraftKings last game. Shot 13 for 19, 6 for 9 from three-point range. Obviously unsustainable numbers. He only played 31 minutes because he's a bench player, came off the bench. CJ Miles was out. Saw a slight bump from that, I guess. Really not much. And the guy is playing well. However, on a short slate tonight, 6.3K, I'm going to stay away from Rodney Stuckey. I'm going to let everyone else chase the big points. Maybe he does put up 30, 35 fantasy points, and that's all well and good. But at that price, I mean, you're going to need right around 30 fantasy points to pay off that tag. So I think he's a guy that, for the most part, I'm going to be avoiding tonight in a less than ideal matchup. I don't know if maybe he sees a little bit of a Giannis Antetokounmpo defense. I'm not sure who's going to stick on him, but Milwaukee is a solid defensive team. So without increase in price tag, a guy off the bench, bad matchup, not something I'm investing in very much. Moving on a little bit more, you've got Chris Middleton, 6.3 on DraftKings and 6.5 on FanDuel, but he's listed as a small forward on FanDuel. Really interesting logs here from Chris Middleton. Been alternating great games and bad games. 45, 21, 48, 23, 46. So if you're a believer in a strange trend like that, seems that this is going to be his 20 to 25 fantasy point game. I mean, he's taking a lot of shots. He's getting huge minutes. The guy's playing very well, but he was 4 for 4 last night from 3. 2 games ago when he had his big 48-point performance, shot 6 for 9 from 3. So the guy's a good shooter. I think he's got significant upside. Probably not for me in cash games, but I do like his upside despite a seemingly tough matchup there against Indiana. But temper your expectations at that price tag. I would rather go a little bit lower to a J.R. Smith, who I don't love as a basketball player, but the guy's been filling up the stat sheet. I mean, 34, 26, 19, 38 fantasy points his last 4 games. It's going to be an up-tempo game. Cleveland's playing good defense, but it's not a great matchup against the Spurs. But at the same time, you're going to want some exposure to this game. Like I mentioned, almost 20 points higher on the total than any other game. So you want cheap exposure. J.R. Smith's the way that I'm going to be going. Getting a little bit of exposure there at a fairly weak shooting guard position. Don't think he's a terrible play there at 5,600 on DraftKings and at 5,800 on FanDuel. Like I said, prefer James Harden, obviously, but I think J.R. Smith's a fine play there. If you want a guy who is in a good spot, but not a great spot, you've had the Memphis Grizzlies struggle against shooting guards this year. Bradley Beal, 5,500 on DraftKings. He's had 6 of his last 7 games, over 21 fantasy points. Hasn't had many of those big blow-up games. We haven't seen any of those since the end of January, beginning of February, before he came back from his injury. So since he's come back, not one of the huge games we've seen from him, but he's a guy with some upside. And if Mike Conley goes tonight, maybe John Wall has a little bit tougher of a time. Maybe Bradley Beal sees some more open shots. I think he has a fine floor right around 20 points, but I'm not expecting that huge game. I don't know that I would play him in a tournament. In a tournament, I'd probably go with a guy like Corey Brewer, sitting at 4,100 against Utah. Like I mentioned, not a great matchup, but at this price, I mean, he can pay this off in a hurry. Last 2 games, obviously much better matchups. 37 and 33 fantasy points. When he gets hot, he's a very streaky shooter, very streaky scorer. So I do like him a decent amount tonight. Only in tournaments. Do not play him in your cash games. A very risky option. But I think that he is in play. I'm not dipping down too much lower here. Wayne Ellington at 5K. I mean, he's getting minutes, but he's not doing much. I think he's a fine cash game play. You expect 20 to 25 fantasy points, which is fine for him at that point. Next up, small forward. LeBron James, your top option. I kind of mentioned that. A tough matchup. I think on a night like tonight, I'm trying to go with a fairly balanced lineup. If I have to choose between a stud, LeBron or James Harden, I'm going with James Harden. Like I said, LeBron in a much tougher matchup. I know looking at past game logs doesn't mean a whole lot, but LeBron in his first game against the Spurs this year, 15, 5, and 9. Kawhi Leonard's job tonight will be slow down LeBron James. And obviously no one can stop LeBron James except for LeBron James. But toughest matchup in the world for a small forward. Kawhi Leonard prides himself on these sorts of situations. So I'm not saying he's going to stop LeBron James. I'm not saying don't play LeBron James. I'm just saying I won't be having LeBron James in every single lineup. I think that he has some upside. He obviously could put up a 60 fantasy point game, so you're going to want some exposure. But I think my cash game staple is going to be James Harden over LeBron James. A little bit lower, Kawhi Leonard is going to be my number 2 play. Obviously, 8,100 on DraftKings, 83 on FanDuel. Playing tremendous basketball recently. 52, 36, 48, 37, 46. The list goes on. Last couple games, he's been playing great. Price obviously up there. Doesn't have a whole lot of upside built in at this price. But matched up with LeBron James, I mean, it's a tough sell on either end there. I think if you got to have one of the two, Kawhi's probably the more risky option, I would say. Obviously doesn't have as much upside, but if both guys have about an average game, then Kawhi Leonard at a nearly $3,000 discount is going to be a guy that's going to help your team out a little bit more. So I don't think he's a terrible swerve off of LeBron James. Not a guy that struggles with foul trouble. Hardly ever. I mean, you look at his last couple logs, 1-1, 3-1, 2. So even in tough matchups, I mean, saw some matchup against Rudy Gay, 1 foul, 3 fouls. It's not really a concern with Kawhi Leonard. He's pretty smart with his hands, makes good plays. So I'm not too concerned about him in that regard, if that was something that was crossing your mind. Next up, Gordon Hayward. To play or stay away here, I'm saying stay away. He's listed as questionable for tonight. Did miss the last game. It's not a terrible spot for him, but Trevor Ariza, despite his age, an above-average defender. Hayward, I'm guessing, if he does go, will not be 100%. So it's a stay away for me at that price tag for Gordon Hayward. Giannis Antetokounmpo, Small forward on DraftKings, shooting guard on FanDuel, 6,900 on DraftKings, and on FanDuel he's 7,000. He's a guy with a lot of upside. I mean, you know he's going to get minutes. You don't love the matchup, but his length just makes him just a nightmare for anyone to guard. It's really hard to predict what you're going to get out of him each night. You'd think maybe he would have a safer floor, given the fact that he can fill up the stat sheet, but he really doesn't. So, tournament play for me, certainly with some upside. Milwaukee, I think if I'm going to choose one guy from Milwaukee's team, it's going to be Michael Carter-Williams on DraftKings specifically. So, Giannis Antetokounmpo, more of a tournament play for me with that low floor. Trevor Ariza, great cash game play, 5,700 on DraftKings and 5,600 on FanDuel. He's in a good spot against Utah, especially if Gordon Hayward ends up sitting. This is a guy that is never flashy. He doesn't usually put up gaudy numbers, but for instance, his last game took only 7 shots but managed 35 fantasy points with 2 steals, a block, 6 assists, 6 rebounds. The guy does a little bit of everything. Perfect cash game play if you need someone cheap, right around that mid-range there at small forward. Another guy I really want to mention, another ideal cash game play, Tony Allen. 4,200 at small forward on DraftKings, 4,400 at shooting guard on FanDuel. Another one of those ones that's kind of switched. Last game, 31.75 fantasy points. A little bit more than what you're going to usually expect out of Tony Allen, but he is a defensive specialist, so he's usually locked into some solid minutes. You can usually expect 20 to 25 there from him, which is more than enough at that price tag. Love him as a cash game play as usual. They call him the grind father, and I call him cash game playable. I love this guy in my cash games. For some reason, he's always under-owned, but even when he's not scoring, the guy produces more than enough to pay off that tag. So if you need someone cheap, just go ahead and slot him in your cash games. Rarely does he disappoint. Moving over to power forward, I'm going with, to play or stay away here, Kevin Love. $7,600 on DraftKings tonight. On FanDuel, a little bit more expensive. He's sitting at $8,100, and I'm saying play Kevin Love. Not a great matchup with Tim Duncan, assuming that he goes, and it seems like he will. But Duncan not playing huge minutes, and Kevin Love under the radar, the guy who kind of seems left out on that big three and for DFS purposes for the Cavaliers. And last game against Dallas, crossover, he was barely 5% owned on DraftKings, which I thought was an absolute travesty. The guy has a double-double waiting to happen. Played just 33 minutes each of the last 2 games, but 37.5, 44.5 fantasy points. It's not a terrible matchup. Tim Duncan does not defend particularly well on the perimeter. Kevin Love likes to stretch the floor. Duncan more of a one-on-one shot blocker type down low. I absolutely love Kevin Love tonight. I am considering him for my cash games, but he is one of my favorite tournament plays on the entire slate, especially at 7,600 on DraftKings. So that's my pick I was mentioning earlier from the Cleveland Cavaliers. Like Kevin Love, quite a good deal. Derek Favors up next, 7,800 on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's at 7,900, so pretty similar prices there. The guy's been playing well. 17, 16, 14 shots in his last 3. A little bit more of a role last game with Gordon Hayward out, but it was against the Knicks. He dominated, 49 fantasy points. The guy's a very safe cash game play now that Enes Kanter's out of town. Rebounding numbers up a little bit, so I like him quite a bit. I like him quite a bit tonight. I prefer Kevin Love just a little bit in tournaments. He'll have a lower ownership, but Derek Favors is a perfectly fine play. Zach Randolph, underpriced still on DraftKings at $7K. I think he's a fine option as well against Washington. If you're looking for a cheaper cash game play, Andrea Bargnani, 58 on DraftKings, 56 on FanDuel. I think he's in a tremendous spot. Somehow the Knicks still a 6.5 point favorite or underdogs in this one, but you gotta like that matchup against the Lakers. This game stays close. I think he is going to be a very popular play anyway, but I really like his upside in this one as well. Should have a safe floor around 20 to 25 fantasy points. If you're looking cheaper here, Ersan Ilyasova, not a great matchup, of course, but cheap, 4,500 and 4,300. I think he's an okay option. Not sure I'd play with my cash games in a tough matchup there. Moving down just a little bit more, Tarek Black, not getting a ton of minutes, but if you're looking for a really cheap guy, 26 and 22 minutes, 20 and 20 fantasy points last 2 games. The guy's been playing well. He's been effective. Obviously pretty risky, but if you got exactly $3,300, on DraftKings or 37 on FanDuel left over. I don't mind sliding him in my cash games if I like the rest of my lineup. But don't expect huge things. 15 to 20 fantasy points, which is pretty solid at that price tag. All right, top option at center. No surprise here. Gobert or go home. Rudy Gobert, $7,800 on DraftKings. On FanDuel, $7,700. Gotta love Rudy Gobert. Looked up some numbers about him. His block percentage on the season, 7.7%, is astronomical. To put in perspective, Anthony Davis, known as one of, if not the best shot blocker in the game, 6% at second. So nearly 1/3 higher than Anthony Davis, who is a tremendous shot blocker. Rudy Gobert, best defensive big man in the league. Scott Brooks, take notes on that. That's my pick for best defensive big man in the league. So if Scott Brooks is watching this, please note that DeAndre Jordan does not hold a candle to Rudy Gobert defensively. But I love Rudy Gobert. His total rebound percentage, 20.5%, sixth in the NBA behind some obvious names, DeMarcus Cousins, Andre Drummond, DeAndre Jordan, guys like that. So he is borderline elite in many categories now down low. Doesn't take a lot of shots, doesn't need to take a lot of shots. Guy can do it all. You like the matchup against Houston. They don't have reliable big man right now without Dwight Howard in town. He's supposed to be back in about 2 weeks, but until that time, I'll continue to target big man against Houston, and it has fared pretty well recently. If you're looking for another cash game play, you can look at Marc Gasol in a fine spot, 7,500 and 7,700. Marcin Gortat, 6,600 on DraftKings and 67 on FanDuel. I'd probably rather pay a little bit more, go with Gasol, than if that's the case, Gobert. But those are really the only three guys that I'm targeting tonight at center. I don't really see the need to reach down. Zaza Pachulia, been playing fairly well, but you don't love the matchup. His minutes have been fluctuating quite a bit. 3,500, I guess if you need a punt, I could go that route. But that's it for me. We're talking single bullet in a tournament. But other than that, that will do it for tonight's slate. Surprisingly, a nice 5-game slate on a Thursday. Make sure you check out some great content we have at dailyfantasycafe.com. Josh Shepardson working on a bunch of MLB previews, so go ahead and check those out as you prepare for the MLB season. We've got some great other pieces coming out. NBA, we've got some pulse, some injury articles, some minutes articles, so a lot of great content for you to see there. Make sure you check it out, and I will see you again along with Spencer Limbach tomorrow.